Alright, welcome to the Podcast Cast. I'm Insuling.
I'm Mark.
And I'm Jarrett, and today we are going to be talking about the South. Now, for those of you who are new to creation, the South is a giant desert that's part of the Threshold. And I guess, Insuling, you can give like a little overview of the whole idea of the South to people.
Yeah, the South is the elemental pole of fire. There are deserts throughout most of it. In fact, one of the driving themes behind the South is the lack of water. The coastlines along the inner sea are rich with abundance and are sprinkled with all manner of very wealthy kingdoms that are able to go out, collect all the bounties of the South, bring them to the coast, and then send them to the rest of the world. Trade routes are essential. You have all kinds of themes of just about anything that you could think of in any kind of I suppose, an Arab-themed adventure.
I'm not going to say a classic desert setting, but it's certainly like you can do all of the tropes that you would want to do in a desert place. People, like, the clothing there is more traditionally like Middle Eastern and Arabic inspired. And things are just generally a bit more. It lets you have a very specific type of game, and that means you can touch on desert themes, and desert themes are super fun.
Especially when you get into factions, when you get into cities and how they work together. Like, there's this kingdom called Harborhead. They're allied with the Realm. They are trying to steal the Varang, like, city-states. If I'm getting that right.
It's close enough. I figure if anybody wants to really look into a lot of these places that we'll talk about, because we'll touch on a few of them, I definitely recommend you check out the wiki for Exalted, because you can find out all about the proper nouns there. Otherwise, we'll just be drowning you in all kinds of proper nouns. And I don't want to do that. I don't want this to be the another episode of let's go on a 20-minute tangent about things that we haven't explained yet.
Yeah, if you go on, like, line right now, you can find, even on YouTube, there's a video series going into immense detail about every aspect of creation on a proper noun level. This podcast, talking about the South, is going to be talking about less specific stuff and more the general cool stuff you can get in the South.
Making it so that you want to play it.
Yeah, exactly.
Plus, it's safe to listen to us while you drive. Don't check the wiki and drive.
I think it might be fun as just a way to introduce us to the topic, to talk about each of our in order favorite things about desert themes and desert stories, like stuff you can do in a desert that you really aren't going to be doing in other places.
Sure.
Archie,
with the South, what I love about the South is, number one, I am a massive fan of Arabic cultures. Dear Lord, they are so cool, and just anything desert, I'm a massive geek about. So my two favorite directions are the West and South. I feel that you can add so many things, like when you're getting into southern elements, like South elements, there's a lot of city-states. You have so many cool kingdoms there, and it is just, again, mainly with Exalted Directions, you can just get engrossed with it.
Yeah, for those of you that don't know, each book, each direction in Exalted has an entire book dedicated to it. And if we were just talking about all the lore in that book, we would have a multi-hour podcast here. So my favorite thing about the South is that with the South, just surviving day to day is an accomplishment. There's such little water, and due to that, such little food. Even for demigods, even for Exalted, it can be hard to live in the South. The South is just a rough place to just survive. And it means you can touch on cool survival elements where you're out in the desert heat. There's no water civilization for miles, and you're trying to figure out how to survive. And it lets you do these really great man versus nature stories because the weather's so extreme here. That's my personal favorite thing. I love the fact that here you have to fight nature.
The books suggest that humanity began in the South. Whoever made the people, the humans in creation. And so the fledgling kingdoms just tried their hardest to survive in those harsh conditions. And from those people who were practicing infighting and warring among each other just for survival, many of the first chosen, the first exalted, came from that crop of humanity. The South also has one of the most well-known gods of war, the Southern god of war and cattle, who is said to have sparked a lot of this conflict by telling mortals to gather their cows and sacrifice them to him for bounties. And in so doing, like I said, a lot of champions among humanity came to being. And so humanity got very good at fighting very fast because they had to in order to survive amongst each other, much less to deal with just all of the other nonsense that's in the South.
Yeah, it's super cool, and it's one of those things where it really lets you touch on the idea that the desert's just really hard to live in. And so the people that choose to live here, or the people that are forced to live here, they're hard people. They're tough, and they've had to go through a lot. It's a lot like how, if you look at Dark Sun, the D&D setting, how everyone's a bit tougher in Dark Sun because it's so dangerous there. Well, it's the same thing here. This place it's a bit more wild. It's a bit less tame than some of the other directions, in places, of course. It's a place where just living day to day requires you to be a special type of person, and that's super neat. Now, another cool thing about about this place, is, well, there's all sorts of kingdoms, and of those kingdoms, there's all of these different types of rulers. So instead of it being like in a lot of directions where there's one major power or maybe two or three, you can interact with almost every type of governmental system, all in one place, because this place, it's so, it's hard to get from one city to another here because it's an endless desert. In other words, the whole place hasn't been conquered. There's not one power here. There's many, and they're incredibly varied.
Well, since the South is so vast, but so much of that land is just almost like negative space. You can't really survive there. And a lot of that space is between kingdoms. It means that it's very difficult to take over the entire South. And so, instead of having a motto kingdom or an omnipresent ruler, you have city-states and small kingdoms, especially along rivers and along the coast. And you end up with these really cool figures, such as the Prefect of Paragon, who's the leader of a city that's actually doing quite well in creation. There's so many cities in the world where their themes are, help us, we need heroes. But if you go to Paragon, everything is fine. There's no crime. There's no poverty. Because the Perfect is able to instantly punish anybody who commits any kinds of these crimes. You basically swear an oath to him, and when you do, there's an open eye symbol that appears on the back of your hand. And if that eye ever closes, that tells everybody that you're an outcast, and if you ever go inside of a building again, you just die. And so people live on the streets begging for scraps, but nobody wants to feed them any because the Perfect can see through their hands. So it's a very Big Brother situation, but the thing is that the Perfect isn't actually a bad guy. He's a nice guy, and he wants to rule everybody. And the reason he has all this power, even though he's immortal, is because he stumbled upon an artifact that's one of two pieces. And if you've ever heard the carrot and the stick analogy, his rod is the stick. It's the thing that punishes people for being unruly. And he would love to find the other half of it to actually reward his people, but unfortunately all he can really reward them with is the knowledge that criminals will be punished.
It leads to this sort of... The Paragon is one of my favorite characters in Exalted, just because Exalted has a bit of a habit of making it so that if you aren't an Exalted or a god or something of similar type, you just don't matter, and nothing you do matters, and you'll never achieve anything because you're permanently doomed.
Oh yeah, Exalted mainly focuses on gods and Exalted.
Exactly. It focuses on the people at the top of the spiritual chain, and it very rarely goes down to like normal humans. And the Paragon's just a person. He has a very powerful artifact, and he appears to be a very shrewd and intelligent man who has taken it upon himself to rule this nation. Or city-state, it might as well be a nation for all intents and purposes. This place, though, it is an Orwellian hellhole, but he doesn't want it to be that. It's just the only way he can keep this society functioning, the only way he can keep everything from falling to chaos and all of his people dead, is by using this artifact. And if he had the other part of the artifact, he could reward his people and bless them just as much as he curses them. And that's the thing. In the city, there are luxuries that don't exist anywhere else. There's luxuries that are considered first stage level because he actually can force everyone to work together, and that's not something anyone can really do. Like, that's something that very few people in creation have been able to successfully do. He can just get people to obey him.
Especially for a mortal.
Yeah, and so his society, he isn't happy with its current place, but he also believes that it's impossible for him to change, for him to loosen up, because it's the only way he can secure power. The brand and its power over people is the only way he can maintain order.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an interesting situation where you have a complex character who has flaws and opinions and beliefs, who's doing what he thinks is right. And it's not just like a blatant black-white evil-good thing. It's just is.
This is only one of several kingdoms in the south. I mean, you have horsemen or horsewomen who are some of the best cavalry in the world, supposedly. And again, the book says, these are mortals, these are people. And so it's nice to see people doing things in the world. But this game isn't about people. This game is about being a big darn hero. Now, what if I told you that if you go out into the wastes and the sun is in just the right spot, the sand under your feet turns black, and for 5 days you walk until the green light of another sun, the first sun, touches your eyes, pierces you, and leaves no shadow in your wake. That's right, everybody. This is the desert sands of Ceciline. So the Yozi Ceciline is the Great Desert, and she exists beyond creation. But she's attached to the south because as a giant desert, she lines up thematically with it. And one of the conditions of her bindings, which again we'll touch on later, is that you can get to her if you walk out into the desert and you just kind of get lost. And so this serves as a way that just normal people can actually get to the demon city of Malpheus without using magic, without opening gateways, without having to make any strange deals. You can just go there. And the demon city of Malpheus is a very interesting place. It's wild. It's full of vibrant colors. The city itself is composed of the things that made the world. Those are the Yozi, the defeated primordial things that gave permanence to everything that you play with in the setting. And so the ability to just go there means that anything that would want to trek with demons, but not have to deal with any expensive intermediaries, can have their caravans just disappear into the desert, go to the demon city, and then return with all kinds of strange stuff.
There's a lot of weird things in the desert of the south. And one of them is that the elementals are active here in a pretty big way. Insulting, this is actually part of the lore that I am fairly unfamiliar with, so if you could explain it.
Oh, sure. So you have the Court of Fire, or they might be called the Summer Court. It's been a while since I've read up on it, but those two things I think those two things are actually two different things. But the important thing is that the elemental courts of creation are composed of intelligent and more permanent things called elementals. And they do their best to see to the natural phenomena of creation. They guide the clouds, they push the waves, they help volcanoes rest until they awaken. Sometimes they're the reason that volcanoes will awaken. They give rise to earthquakes. Just any kind of natural phenomenon is often driven by elementals in some one way or another. And the court in the south actually has a very active elemental court. Like, you can go and you can talk to them and try to make deals with them. And this elemental court is kind of an interesting parable for humanity, or I suppose a fable. So what the elemental courts do or did is they looked at the somewhat dysfunctional workings in heaven and the way that gods work, and they said, well, gods often deliberate, and so as a good court, we should also deliberate. Gods often bicker, and so as a good court, we should bicker. Gods often betray each other. Therefore, as a good standing court, we should betray each other. Elementals aren't stupid, but they don't always know how to do things, because a lot of times they're just born of the world and they don't know the full picture. They don't know why the gods do it. They just see them doing it. And so going to the court of flame is a rough trip, because there's these elementals there that are still kind of learning how to be people, but they're in extremely important situations, or not situations, important positions. And so you're basically talking to like major censors of the South, people who deal with elemental crimes and watching over the gods, except these people don't really know why their position is important. All they know is that bribery is a thing that gods expect, so as a good standing member of this court, obviously I should expect some bribes.
They, basically, they are incredibly uninformed about well, it's not necessarily uninformed. It's more like they're incredibly inexperienced, because a lot of them, like, don't have life experience. And because of that, they have made a series of horrible, horrible assumptions that have caused them to, not through malice, but through just not knowing what they're doing, basically turn into a horrifying, corrupt bureaucracy, just like heaven.
They don't mean it. They don't want to be bad.
It's not intentional.
They're just trying to be good at their jobs, but the only people that they've seen mirror their work are gods, and gods aren't always good people.
Exactly.
It's more of ignorance rather than malice.
Yeah. And it's cool, though, because you can, like, run around and interact with these people who have this weird philosophy and this weird way of interacting. And they're cool elemental people. And when we say elemental, the mental image you're probably getting is like either like a bonfire or like a monster shaped like water. But elementals can look like a whole host of shapes. Some of them like look like they're material and not made out of water, but they're just like have a colored skin, and it always looks like I don't know, wind is blowing through their hair or something. Like, elementals can look really weird and have a massive variety of hypothetical abilities and shapes and forms.
Oh yeah, sometimes the sea foam will give rise to dogs, basically sea dogs, and they're good boys. I've summoned them several times in old games. There are also, dogs of the root, I think they're called, or dogs of the soil, that farmers will often pay tribute to, because these elementals kind of protect the untamed forests. And obviously, as a farmer, you want to cultivate your land, and so by giving offerings to these elementals, they stay their wrath.
So, aside from the elemental courts, which are super interesting on their own, there's also the idea that all throughout the South, there are constant low-level skirmishes for land and resources. remember, the main god of war is based in the South. Like, aside from the Maiden, who's the Maiden of War, like, or the Maiden of Battles, like, he's the big war guy of the pet of the gods. And the reason is, he's also the god of cattle. And Insuling was talking about this earlier, but basically he forces people to sacrifice cattle, which means there's this constant lack of cattle, which encourages people to steal and kill each other for cattle so they can sacrifice it. And it creates this vicious cycle that leads to, like, among the various small city-states, an almost constant low-level warfare.
You will have kingdoms from allied both by the realm fighting each other just for land and resources.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that you as players can get involved. You can, like, if there's a city you like, the players can protect the city from people trying to steal their cattle. Or if the players are of a assertive sort, they can go to other cities and steal their cattle. And mine, since it's Exalted, I'm not talking about 1 or 2 cows. I'm talking about an entire, like going to, like, a giant city and just stealing all of the food in the city. Like, that's the type of crazy stuff Exalted can get up to. And that's what you can do in the South. You can get engrossed in this intertribal warfare.
Yeah, and if you really want to avoid a lot of problems, sometimes killing 1,000 cows is a really good idea. Thanks for your idea, Seawolf. You'll hear more about him when we get to the Sponsored by Nobody's Masters of the Universe podcast. Princes of the Universe.
See, human sacrifice and
Oh, boy.
sacrifice of all kinds works in Exalted. Objectively, killing a bunch of living things is a very useful thing to do in Exalted, especially if you're doing it for a god who gets power and glory by you doing that, and it's basically celestial bribery. So if you give a bunch to a certain god, there's a chance he'll probably repay the favor, especially if you plan on giving more if he does. Like, you can kind of get into that, and yeah, there's a lot of Exalted and a lot of humans that really get into sacrificing things for Trek.
Yeah, the South has an interesting dichotomy in that it's both secluded and resource-starved, but you can get to it. Which means that if the gods get too uppity and too demanding, armies can come and find them and deal with them. But since there's still a need, there's a lot of, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. And so that gives a lot of... it opens the door to a lot of religion in the game. And even forming religions around gods, making holidays. Like, one of my favorite things to do is invent holidays in a game. Because you just pull out the calendar, figure out what day it is, track the days, and then, oh, hey, it's this holiday. Hey, guys, let's roleplay this.
Yeah, and that's something that you can do. You can have all of this religious interaction with the setting that a lot of campaigns would just skip over, or would have your characters not interacting with at all.
And that gets the characters, like, it motivates the players to roleplay their characters. How does my character feel about this specific event?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for example, and we're going to get into this in a separate video, but if you look, as an aside, at the cast of Princes of the Universe, they have an incredibly interesting opinion of human sacrifice. One of the more interesting things about the West is that because the various places and these various setting elements are coming together, any individual element would kind of be a bit weaker on its own, but when you combine all of these things together, they kind of create this really interesting synergy, because you have this stuff with all of these cattle, people raiding for resources and cattle over here, and then you have these very interesting cultures and societies like the Paragon and all of that, and we told you about Paragon. And then there's stuff about the fact that the South is just entirely covered in ruins and things from previous ages, and there's just so much stuff to find there. There's cities where the main thing that they do is hunt for artifacts. Like,
oh, yeah.
There's so much to find and discover and claim in the South.
Yeah, it's a very It's very good if you're the type of DM or player that really loves their lore and really loves runes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are just entire cities that are buried under the sands that have just been lost to time because things didn't always used to be so dry and bleak in the south. That's a fairly recent phenomena. Before there were projects that were underway to force water down far into the south, and so it was kind of a verdant paradise. But when the contagion and other calamities affected the world, that stopped. And so it's just a dried up husk of a remains of what it used to be.
Yeah, and that's super fun. Now I believe in Sulling, you would be best suited to talk about the next topic because I believe you have a strong opinion on it.
Oh boy, strong opinions. Yeah, so the South is big, and like I said, it has a lot of negative space. If you want to get away from all of the stuff that's going on in the canon setting, and there's a lot, and we're going to cover that in a future episode, possibly in the bad episode that we promised before. Maybe we'll have a more lighthearted one about just the setting in general. But if you want to get away from all that, the South is a good choice. It's difficult to get through, it's difficult to move an army through, and there's all kinds of resources down there. And so if you have the ability to create food and summon water and basically just do all the busy work that's necessary to force a kingdom into the South, it's possible for you to just say, hey, I'm going to build my own sandbox. And in this sandbox, I'm building my sandcastle. And we're just going to play down here for a while. And that can actually be kind of a fun game, because when you do that, when you leave civilization and you strike out on your own, you can end up running into the fair folk, which are the things that live outside of civilization and outside of the world. And these groups get weird and can be quite frightening for players who might not be aware of just how strange the fair folk can be. The fair folk are not people. The fair folk are entities that entered into the world and were forced to give shape. They're the stuff of raw chaos that now have a form and don't want to go back into that raw chaos because the world has forced permanence upon them. But they can't just wander around the world because they hunger. And the only things that can really feed them are finding a place of power, such as what's known as a demesne or a manse, or they eat souls. They devour the virtues from humans, and they leave the humans as these people, but they have no drive. They have no passions. They're just people, and they unfortunately make ideal slaves. And so there's actually a skin trade in the South with a group called the Guild that will sell people to the fair folk in exchange for the exotic goods that the fair folk can trade. And then in exchange for more people, they'll then trade back the people that they just consumed. Have fun.
If you're the type of, like, if you're players, or you yourself as a DM, or if you're a player listening, if you want to do a game where you just rile against someone being an asshole, the South has pretty much everything you can want. It has random gods who are completely evil, and as random gods who are like a weird mix, so you can't just automatically kill everything. It has fae, who are absolute monsters, and it also has like these weird skin trade slave guilds who you can go and murderize. And so it leaves a lot of room for someone to go out and be a big damn hero, which is the whole point of Exalted. And that's super cool. That's super fun. And that's why the South is super fun to play in.
Or you can just start a slave ring.
Oh yeah, you can also do that. I mean, you know,
That is
what
the recommended.
that is the recommended option.
Slavery is bad. End it all. I mean the world. End the world. Yeah, second edition is fun. Maybe we'll do a mechanics episode sometime so I can explain to you, listener, how I figured out how to end the world in about 11 and a half minutes. All of it. The entire setting. Every mountain. Every river. Dead. There can't be slaves if there are no people. Now, that sounds insane, but unfortunately a lot of Exalted players tend to just go skipping down that road.
There can't be evil if everything is dead.
If there's nothing to compare anything to, nothing can be subjective.
Exactly. Now, this brings us on to something which I'm pretty excited about. It's one of my favorite things about the South, and it's something that I kind of want to talk about a bit here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Fire, dust, and explosives. Okay, so on the outset, when you first look at them, your first thought is going to be, okay, well, this is the gun analog of the setting, and it lets you have bombs and stuff. And what fire dust is that basically, like, as you get further towards the wild and further towards the elemental pole of fire, you'll run across this sand that's been, like, attuned to the elemental pole of fire. So it works like gunpowder. Not on an exact level, but, like, for example, if you have a fire dust, they call them fire wands, and so you point it at someone and shoot it, instead of shooting a bullet or a propulsion of anything, it'll just shoot a blast of pure fire at someone, which is pretty wild. And people get in a lot of really interesting ruts about fire wands. Like, for one, a lot of people don't understand that even though, yeah, like, to us as someone outside of the setting, it looks like a six-shooter, and so people's immediate thought is, okay, they're guns. But they're really sort of intended to be the wizard weapons, that they're weapons that a mage uses, because, like, to most people across all of creation, they don't understand the concept of a fire wand at all. It just points his hand, or points a stick at them, and fire explodes out from hell. That's their understanding. It doesn't matter if, like, from an outside meta level, we get that most of the art depicts them as looking like guns. They aren't really guns. They're magic wands.
Yep. They imagine like the alchemist on a mountain, and you go and you ask him for help in whatever it is that you need, and he says no, and then you get mouthy with them, and then they point their staff at you, and your face melts. Your friend is probably going to go back down the mountain after that.
So, a cool thing about fire wands is that unlike a gun, which you point at someone, you pull the trigger, and a bullet flies so fast that no one can see it, and it hits someone in the head, and then it goes through their brain, they die. Every time you fire a fire wand, what you're really doing is causing a massive explosion. It doesn't shoot a bullet, it causes an explosion of fire to come out of the end of the barrel. What does that mean? That means, A, you can be a super badass guy walking around with like a six-shooter that points and fires at someone and causes like them and everyone in their immediate vicinity to erupt into fire because they dared mess with the man with the magic stick. And at the same time, and again, we've talked about how they're not actually guns, but at the same time, if you want to just make a character who has a cowboy hat and wears cowboy clothes and has a six-shooter fire wand that he shoots people with and says cowboy things, you can totally do that too.
Yeah.
So, just because it's not just a gun doesn't mean you can't do the whole cowboy thing.
Plus, the armies of the South use this stuff fairly regularly in their line troops. So imagine you're charging towards the enemy line, and then all of a sudden their entire front line just erupts into fire. And then the battle starts.
Oh, yeah. And you can have cool, like, because if you've studied some of the more out there early Asian weapons making use, or Asiatic weapons making use of early fireworks, there's some interesting stuff you can do with explosives. For example, there's this thing called a fire lance, which is basically a normal polearm, but with a tube packed full of really primitive gunpowder that, when it would be lighted, would catch on fire and shoot out. But because of the way gunpowder was made and how gunpowder didn't burn as quickly as it did now, it would get stuck into people's clothing and still burn, and it would act like you couldn't put it out because it was a self-oxygenator. So like even if you like tried to like put out the fire, it would keep burning because the gunpowder was burning too slow to just instantly go out like normal gunpowder. But at the same time, it was burning way too it burns too hot. Have all this super cool stuff, this crazy stuff. You can have like people who roll up with like these things that have like hundreds of little bottle rocket style things and just fire them over a battlefield, and you can just go nuts with it.
And in which my opinion is that's a lot cooler than just a gun.
Yeah,
because you'll get a lot of scenes where it's just like, oh, I shoot at the guy. And Exalted is very known for describing how you kill the person.
Yeah. Exalted is all about doing things flashily. So, like, with a gun, with a fire wand that's just a gun, shoot, and it causes a big explosion, and that's super cool. But you can also do something like running up to someone, stabbing them with a spear, and then a split second later, the head of the spear explodes like a grenade and sends the person and their friends blasting through a wall. You can be, like,
have really a fire wand that's a walking cane.
Yeah, you can be creative with it and have really weird things, and that's super cool. The West, not the West.
The South, you ignorant fool.
The South.
Get off my podcast.
Yeah, you just kicked me on the spot. The South has a ton of really, like, because of the prevalence of this technology, and it doesn't really, it's super rare anywhere else in the world. Because of this, you can have just these crazy fights that are having constant explosions, and fights. The more times something explodes, the cooler said fight becomes. That's my official opinion. And I want to know what you think, Art.
So, Exalted is all about being an anime character. Guns from the anime that I've watched, okay? That's my take. Alright, like, when you're in Exalted, sure, having a gun is cool, and having, like, a Spec Ops team is fun. But then it just comes into, like, oh, well, you're shooting a gun? Okay, you shoot. Okay, let's see if you hit. Alright, you shoot him. Good. With a fire wand, you can just start, like, barraging a person and just, like throw it right down their mouth and make it explode itself.
And now we see what Exalted is doing to our future generations. Maybe the Satanic Panic had the right of it.
I'm not saying that I mean, this is an interesting point. In Exalted, if you're dying and a demon comes up to you and says, "Hey kid, do you want ultimate power?" Always say yes. Objectively, it is the correct decision within Exalted's lore. I want to point that out.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, nothing can go wrong, because if you turn it down, you just die. So, saying yes, there's no repercussions for that.
Yeah.
Like, all the demons, they lost. You can just tell them to go to hell. You don't have to listen to them.
The thing about Exalted is that when you are chosen and given the power, it cannot be taken away. And so if something comes to you and grants you power, take it and never give it back.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Exalted encourages children to accept deals from demons. The South is full of violence and insanity and slavery. And everything about this aspect of the world is metal as all hell. You could, there are a mountain of heavy metal, like, bands that you could just take the stuff that they put on the front cover, like the cool, crazy, like psychedelic stuff. You can just throw that in. It'll fit, probably.
I just looked up heavy metal album covers to see if any one of them popped up. The Great Divide, Iron Maiden, Metal Inquisitor. Yeah, these all look pretty rad. I'd play in those settings.
Exactly, right? And that's what Exalted is. Okay, listeners, so we've prattled on about the South for a good little while here, and we tried to not focus as much on the proper nouns and kind of zoom out to the general stuff you can do in the region. And I think we've pretty well covered that. So this has been the Cast. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.